Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Enid Geyer, Associate Dean for Information Resources and Technology, and also Director of the library. The library provides lots of services and resources to support our faculty, staff, and students in their learning, teaching, research, and patient care activities, and publishing certainly falls within that range. Scholarly publishing has been a hot topic for a very long time, and with all the recent changes in the industry, it remains a topic. As evidenced by all of you being here, even though we're serving food, I know there's interest in this topic based on the number of questions that we get in the library, anything from how do I start to how do I get my publication noticed. So it's something that most people are interested in, and it's certainly not a surprise because it's so fundamental to our success in academics and in our careers for advancement and also for recognition. So today we are very fortunate to have George Woodward here from Elsevier. George is the executive publisher, and he's here to talk to us about the changing world of scholarly publishing. George has worked in scholarly publishing for the last 15 years, covering a range of subjects from health and medicine to social sciences and the life sciences. Before joining Elsevier, he also worked as a managing editor, overseeing the editorial and review processes for a pair of leading immunology journals. As part of his current role, he presents to researchers and clinicians around the U.S., providing an insider's perspective on the publishing process and how to get the most out of it. While George works for Elsevier, it's very important to note that he is not here to promote the company, but rather talk from a broad perspective about publishing, regardless of where you are submitting or considering to submit. He'll talk about journal publication cycle, ethics, preparing your manuscript, selecting a journal, your rights post-publication, open access publishing, and how to get your paper noticed for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier for your career and for your scholarship. There should be plenty of time for questions, and I think George is going to stop between sections of his presentation to allow for that, so feel free to raise your hand or speak up. He's also told me that he prefers to have an interactive, lively discussion, so I encourage your participation, but to ensure that that happens, we have a few ringers here to make sure that conversation is, I won't say entertaining, but definitely interesting and realistic. So Dr. Mandeep Sidhu is the Associate Professor of Medicine, Division of Cardiology, and Assistant Dean for Medical Education and Student Research here at Albany Med. He has served as the Associate Editor for a Cardiology section of the Clinical Decision Support Text and as a reviewer for the American Journal of Cardiology, Trends in Cardiovascular Medicine, and the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Dr. Sidhu has co-authored over 60 peer-reviewed manuscripts, including book chapters, and is very familiar with the challenges of authorship. Dr. Amy Hahn has also agreed to participate. She is the director of the Albany Medical Center Transplant Immunology Laboratory and a professor in the Department of Surgery. Dr. Hahn has held several editorial roles for the Society of Histocompatibility and Immunogenetics, including chair of the Publications Committee, editor-in-chief of their quarterly publication, co-editor of the 4th edition of the Laboratory Manual, and co-editor of the 25th anniversary commemorative book. She assumed the position of editor-in-chief of Human Immunology, their flagship publication in 2006, and has many years as a reviewer, editorial board, and section editor. Dr. Andrew Chang is a professor of emergency medicine and vice chair of research and academic affairs. Dr. Chang is an experienced researcher and author with publication in peer-reviewed journals, including JAMA and most recently, Academic Emergency Medicine. I thank you all for participating in advance. If you haven't already grabbed some food, I encourage you to do so at any point. It's okay to get up and move around, no problem in doing that. We also understand that the students in the audience may have to leave for a 1 o'clock class. Again, that's absolutely fine. No problem. So right now, though, please join me in welcoming George.
Good afternoon. The other piece of housekeeping I'll just add quickly is that a recording will be available later. So if you do have to leave, you won't miss out on anything. I'll also highlight that my email address is on this very first slide. So if you do have to leave, you don't have a chance to ask a burning question, please feel free to contact me afterwards at that address, and I can get back to you. So today, over the next just under 2 hours, we're going to cover a lot of ground. It's already been previewed for you a little bit. We will pause frequently for questions, but the reason that we're spending so much time talking about this is because, as was just acknowledged, it's a changing environment that we're talking about. I'd always like to start with a little bit of a history of scholarly journals. They go back to 1665 when Oldenburg publishes the very first journal, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society out of London. And then over the next few hundred years, it starts to take a shape that will probably be familiar to many of you already. Eventually, it starts arriving every month, every quarter, every year. It's usually available to members of a particular society. One of the main benefits of joining that society is to receive that journal. Somewhere, depending on who you ask, between, say, the 19th century and World War II, peer review starts to become more and more of a topic of interest, a way of traditionally doing things with a journal. And the reason it evolves now is because the scientific endeavor has expanded to a point where it's getting increasingly hard to say that a small group of editors could have sufficient knowledge to make judgments on any article that comes across their desks. So they start calling on external reviewers. Then about 30 years ago, things really start to accelerate. It's with the World Wide Web launching, because now you've got new ways of finding the content, you've got new ways of accessing the content. When we think about peer review, we now have new ways of engaging people who maybe weren't involved in that peer review process before because it would have been logistically challenging. Maybe people wouldn't have been aware of their work. 10 years later, Google comes, and all of a sudden, that discovery question becomes that much more complex, or maybe simpler. For a lot of our journals at the moment, Google Scholar are their primary points of entry. Then we skip forward a little bit further. Wikipedia challenges us to think about content creation, knowledge creation, and knowledge dissemination. The open access movement, which is in its second decade at this point, starts saying, well, wait a second, let's think about why do we have to subscribe to these journals? Why do we hide these journals behind what are called paywalls? Isn't there a better, more equitable way of getting access to this content? Social media. If I gave this presentation a few years ago and said, Twitter is a major force in scholarly communications, people would have laughed at me. But at the moment, once every 7 seconds on some form of social media, there's a mention of a scholarly article. It's become a huge part of that conversation. And then over there on the right, the devices that we read it on. Because if you think about, for those first several hundred years, an article was fixed into a certain sized rectangle. It had to be logistically capable of being mailed. It had to follow a similar format. And so if you have figures within them, if you have tables within them, they're limited to a certain small-sized rectangle. But now, people are reading on devices that are originally bigger than your standard journal, but getting increasingly smaller. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means for you as an author as well as a reader, because writing for someone on a mobile phone is a different prospect in a lot of ways. So what has stayed the same? Oldenburg espoused that there were four main values, four main points that a journal was able to bring. Registration, the timestamp of who officially submitted results first, importance for claiming ownership or at least primacy. Certification, performing peer review to ensure that there's at least hopefully an air of validity to this, to help separate out unvetted manuscripts, unvetted science from vetted. And we'll talk plenty about peer review later. Dissemination, as we already talked about, that's changing quite significantly. And then, and this one often gets overlooked in the modern world, preservation. And it's easy to think about that 1665 journal and how there are still copies that exist somewhere in the world. But if you think about an electronic-only journal and all these PDFs, and right now, sure, we have plenty of PDFs, and there's multiple copies of a single article. But as that technology evolves, how are we going to ensure that the articles are not lost, that the knowledge within is not lost? I have a whole drawer full of floppy disks from about 20 years ago that remind me constantly of technology evolving. My disclaimer before I go too much further is scholarly publishing is not a homogeneous enterprise. Needs and practice do vary greatly from one field to another. So I'll try to acknowledge some of the differences, but do bear in mind that for your own specific specialties, there are going to be some changes. Venues of publishing can vary. When I talk to broad audiences, I'm often reminded that computer science values heavily meeting abstracts and those kinds of presentations. Software, different forms of expression like that. Social sciences, humanities, it's about the long form, the monograph. So we're really focusing today on medical publishing, obviously, given the audience. But it is worth bearing in mind that when you try to extrapolate messages or what works in one area of scholarly publishing, it doesn't necessarily mean it translates over to another area. Levels of funding can vary significantly. We'll talk about this particularly in context of the open access movement, where there's a lot of, there's a sense that we can just shift from paying expenses on the reader side to paying expenses on the authorship side, which is all very well and good if you have a massive grant that's willing to underwrite that. But what about people who are conducting smaller studies, people who maybe don't have that same level of funding? What can they do? We'll talk about that. Demographics vary, and this is not necessarily a statement about technology uptake. The largest group of people that I've seen reading print journals in the past 12 months have been groups of students, sitting on planes, passing them around, highlighting them. So demographics can mean a number of different things, such as emergency room doctors read very differently from allergists. They have different setups, they have different practical working conditions. It's going to make a difference. Normal review and publication times can vary. We'll talk a little bit about what to expect. Types of review can vary. And then citation